everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain. And this week, it is just so amazing. The daf mentions the concepts of Pesach Mitzraim versus Pesach Dorot, the Paschal Lamb offering and the general Pesach holiday in Egypt versus or parallel to the Paschal Lamb offering and the general Pesach experience in future generations. And this is such a perfect topic because this shiur happens to be coming out a few days before Pesach itself. So I want to talk about the concept of Pesach Mitzrayim versus Pesach Dorot / Pesach Mitzrayim as connected to Pesach Dorot because I think it will deepen our understanding of how Chazal viewed Pesach. So let's actually get started not with the Gemara in Menachot that is talking about this issue yet. I actually want to get started with a very significant pasuk in the discussion of to what extent is the Pesach that was done in Egypt similar to the Pesach that is going to be done in future generations. Or maybe I should ask it in the reverse. To what extent is the Pesach of future generations similar to the Pesach that was done in Egypt? Now, there is one pasuk that Chazal keep coming back to suggest similarities between them, and that is a pasuk in Shmot Yud Gimel, pasuk Hey. And it's interesting to note that when you look through Shmot chapter 12 and Shmot chapter 13, you'll see a mixing of things that seem to be implying that it's talking about Pesach Mitzrayim, specifically Pesach in Egypt, and also Pesach Dorot, what's going to be in the future, especially when you get to the land of Israel. So here's a pasuk that's about Pesach Dorot. V'haya ki ivyacha Adonai el eretz hakna'ani v'achiti v'emori v'achivi v'yevusi. When God will bring you to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, asher nishba la'avotecha lateit lach, that God has promised to your ancestors to give to you. Eretz zavat chalav udvash, a land flowing with milk and date honey. Ve'avadata et ha'avodah hazot, you shall do this avodah, this performance, this ritual, b'chodesh hazeh, in this month. Meaning, the stuff that's just been described as Pesach Mitzrayim, the ritual that you're supposed to do of the Paschal Lamb in Egypt, you should be doing this same avodah, this same action in future years, even when you're in the land of Israel. Makes it sound like Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Dorot should perhaps be identical. Well, when we look in our Gemara in Menachot from this week, Pei Bet Amud Aleph to Pei Bet Amud Bet, 82a to 82b, we do see that there is a use of this pasuk to really suggest that there is something connecting Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Dorot. In this case, that they both should come from chulin, meaning the animal that's bought for the korban Pesach, and in fact, the animal that's bought for any korban that is required, including when someone makes a neder, when someone says, Hare alai, X, I have to give the following korban. Any of those should always come from chulin. They should always be bought with mundane money. They should not be bought with money that was actually used to redeem maaser sheni. We know that for maaser sheni, the secondary tithe, if you couldn't bring all of that produce of that secondary tithe to Yerushalayim, you would instead redeem the produce with money, and that money was something you were then supposed to use to purchase food in Yerushalayim. Now, while the korban shlamim, that is a nidava, when someone says such and such animal will be a shlamim, that is allowed famously to be bought with that maaser sheni money, because a korban shlamim you're going to eat, but any other korban, including a neder korban shlamim, because it's a chovah, is supposed to be with non-maaser sheni money, and that is what the mishnah in Menachot on Pei Bet Amud Bet tells us. Minayin la'omer hare alai todah. How do you know that if somebody says, I'm giving a neder, I'm requiring myself to give a Thanksgiving offering, shelo yavi ela min hachulin, they have to bring using money that is non-consecrated money. They have to buy it with that, i.e., not with Maser Sheni money, even though they're going to get to eat part of it, right? And of course, the Maser Sheni money, you just have to use it to eat in Yerushalayim. But even so, Talmud Lomar, well, this is why the Torah says, V'zavachta Pesach LaHashem Elokecha tzon uvakar. In Dvarim Ted it does not say you bring the Pesach from only a seh, right? From only a lamb. Instead, it says it can be from sheep or from cattle. And the Mishnah says, V'alo Pesach ein ba ela mina kavsim u'mina yizim. That doesn't make any sense because when you look in Shemot, we know that the Pesach can only be brought of a lamb or of a goat. Im ken ma Talmud lomar tzon uvakar. So why does Devarim Ted Zayin tell you that it can be from sheep or from cattle? La'akish kol haba min hatzon u'min habakar lePesach. To compare any korban that comes from sheep or any korban that comes from cattle to the korban Pesach. Ma Pesach davar shebechovah. Just as Pesach is something that is a required korban. Ve'ein ba ela min hachulin. And it can only be purchased with mundane money, i.e. not Maser Sheni money. Af kol davar shebechovah, so too any korban, whether it's of sheep or it's of cattle, whether it's a shlamim, whether it's a toda, right? Any sheep or cattle that's offered as a korban in a way that is required even, for example, if somebody says, Hare alai shlamim or Hare alai toda, I'm now being mechayevet et atzmi, right? I'm now requiring it of myself. Ein ba ela min hachulin. It has to be bought with chulin money, right? So the Mishnah tells us that, but I want us to notice, well, the Gemara then says, and I'm skipping the end of the Mishnah, but the Gemara then says, wait a second, how do you know that the Korban Pesach was not bought with Maser Sheni money? Meaning, of course, we know in Mitzrayim it wasn't bought with Maser Sheni money. But what about Pesach Dorot? Who says Pesach Dorot can't be bought with Maser Sheni money? And this is where we're going to get to our pasuk from Perek Yud Gimel of Shemot. Pesach Gufa Min Alan. How do we know that the Korban Pesach cannot be bought with Maser Sheni money? And then it serves as the precedent for any Chova Korban, any Korban Chova. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ne'amar Pesach b'Mitzrayim, v'Ne'amar Pesach l'Dorot. Right? Well, we know that, the term Paschal offering applies to the Pesach in Egypt, and the term Paschal offering refers to the korban also when it's, beyond once they're in the land of Israel. Ma Pesach Hamor b'Mitzrayim lo ba'ela min hachulin. Just like the Pesach in Egypt obviously could not have been bought with Maser Sheni money. There was no such thing as Maser Sheni yet. Af Pesach Hamor l'Dorot lo ba'ela min hachulin. So too, Pesach Dorot also, it should never be bought. Even in future generations, when we have such a thing as Maser Sheni, you still can't use that money, even though you're going to eat from the animal. You still can't use that money. It's still a precedent. Amalei Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says to Rabbi Eliezer, wait a second. V'chidanin efshar mishi efshar. Why should you learn Pesach Dorot from Pesach Mitzraim in this situation? Pesach Mitzrayim, there was no such thing as Master Sheni money. Of course, they couldn't have brought it from, they couldn't have used Master Sheni money to buy it. And you're then going to assume that the same applies to Pesach Dorot? Why? There they could use Master Sheni money, meaning it was possible. There was such a thing. Amar lo, so he says, well, Afal Pisha Efshar, even though in Mitzrayim they couldn't, Raya Gdolahi v'nilmad himena. Says, you know what? It's a clear precedent, and we're going to learn from it. Okay, we're still going to learn the halakha from it. Chazar Rabbi Akiva v'dano din acher. So Rabbi Akiva says, okay, you want to be consistent? You want to compare Pesach Dorot and Pesach Mitzrayim on all these different ways? Well, then why not Mala Pesach Mitzrayim, just as in Egypt with the Paschal offering? Shekain ein ta'un matan damim ve'emurin legabe Pesach, legabe Mizbeach, excuse me. In Pesach in Egypt, they didn't have to actually put any blood on the Mizbeach. They didn't have to burn any fats on the Mizbeach. Then maybe Tomar b'Pesach Dorot, what are you going to say about Pesach in, once we had even a Mishkan, but once we had a Beit HaMikdash, what are you going to say about Pesach Dorot? Sheta'un matan damim ve'emurin legabe Mizbeach. That does require blood on a Mizbeach, and it does require burning fats on a mizbeach, right? So how could you say, well, whatever was done in Pesach Mitzrayim, done Pesach Dorot, that wasn't bought with Maser Sheni money, so this can't be bought with Maser Sheni money either. There's a major difference between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Dorot. Major difference. One of them has to be done, with blood on the altar and with fats on the altar, and the other one, that's not the way it went. So Amar Lo, he says, well, Harehu Omer v'avadat avodah hazot b'chodesh hazeh, shiur kol avodot shel chodesh hazeh kazeh. Says, yeah, it's true. Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Dorot, it's true that there are differences between them, but there are certain similarities, and those similarities, such as you can't buy it using Maser Sheni money, are covered by the pasuk that says you're going to do this practice in this month, meaning even once God brings you to the land of Israel. In other words, what we're supposed to expect is there are some things that are going to be different among Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Dorot, and some things that are going to be similar. And this Gemara is making the case for a similarity between them. Neither one is allowed to be bought from Maser Sheni money. A difference between them, Pesach Mitzrayim, you put blood on the doorpost. There's no mizbeach. Pesach Dorot, you have a mizbeach. You have to put blood on the mizbeach. You have to also burn fats on the mizbeach. Great. So now we're getting into the question of what are the things that Pesach Dorot and Pesach Mitzrayim have in common, and what are the things that they don't have in common, right? So the Mishnah in Pesachim is very quick about it. Ma ben Pesach Mitzrayim le Pesach Dorot. What's the difference between the Pesach in Egypt and the Pesach of the generations? Now we have to remember, by the way, the Pesach in the Midbar is, kind of an interesting one because Pesach in the Midbar, they also didn't have Maser Sheni money yet, right? They didn't. It's once they get to the land of Israel. So Pesach in the Midbar, in that regard, is similar to the Pesach in Mitzrayim. But in other regards, because they had a Mishkan, Pesach Mitzrayim is similar to Pesach Dorot, right? So it's an interesting question, right? Literally that liminal space of the wilderness. So Ma bein Pesach Mitzrayim le Pesach Dorot, what's the difference between the Pesach in Egypt and the Pesach for all the generations? Pesach Mitzrayim mikcho ba'asor. We know Pesach in Egypt, to read Shemot Yud Bet, it'll tell you have to take it on the 10th of Nisan. V'ton hazaya ba'agudat ezov al mashkof al shtei mezuzot. You have to put the blood using a hyssop bunch. You have to put the blood on the lintel and on the two posts. V'ne'echal b'chipazon b'layla echad. And you're supposed to eat it, matnechem chagurim. You're supposed to eat it with your bags on. You're supposed to eat it with your belts on. You're supposed to be eating it in a rush, right? In one night. Pesach Dorot, no hey kol shiva. And the Pesach of the generations is observed for 7 days. Now we're going to go through what exactly does this mean. 1 day versus 7 days. We're probably talking about chametz. We're also going to say, oh, well, that's interesting because it turns out that in the Beit HaMikdash, they actually did want to take things 4 days ahead and, look at it before the korban tamid even. Maybe, it would be like put aside 4 days before to make sure it didn't have a mum. But what we've done so far is we've at least broad strokes said, think about it. Here, we're not talking about mizbeach, not mizbeach. It's really a focus on Pesach Mitzrayim, right? From the 10th, and the blood on the doorpost, and eating it in a rush, right? Whereas Pesach Dorot is something else, right? It's all 7 days. Now, I just want to look at the psukim for a second, because Shemot Yud Bet is really where you're going to get the Pesach Mitzrayim info. And Devarim Tetzayin, Devarim 16, is really where you're going to get the Pesach Dorot info. So Shemot Yud Bet, a major difference between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Dorot is Mishkan, or Beit HaMikdash, right? In Shemot Yud Bet, what are you going to do? You're going to put the blood on the doorposts. But there's even a little more subtlety here. I'm just taking one piece, but you could really sit down with Shemot Yud Bet and Devarim Tetzayin and just sit and enjoy the different dimensions that each is offering. You're supposed to watch that korban, watch the animal for 4 days, right? You took it on the 10th and you wait till the 14th. This is Pesach Mitzrayim. And everybody is going to slaughter it at twilight. Right? And they're going to take from the blood, they're going to put it on the two posts and on the lintel on the houses that they're in. Now, when you look in Devarim Tetzayin, you have a little bit of a different feel here, right? So Devarim Tetzayin, Shamor et Chodesh Ha'aviv, V'asita Pesach L'Hashem Elokecha, right? Keep the spring month and do a Pesach for God. meaning a Paschal lamb. Ki b'chodesh ha'aviv hotziacha Hashem Elokecha Mitzrayim laila, because God took you out of Egypt at night. V'zavachta Pesach l'Hashem Elokecha, you will give the Pesach to God, tson uvakar, sheep or cattle, which of course Chazal interpret sheep or cattle. It can't be that it refers to cattle for the korban Pesach, but you just experience, the way that the pshat in Devarim Tet Zayin is, it reads as it can be sheep or cattle, but makom asher yivchar Hashem l'shakein shmo sham, in the place where God chooses to rest God's name. In other words, Mishkan or Mikdash, right? That's the major, major difference. I also want to point out that there's already a little bit of a difference that's indicated. Are you doing this bein ha'arbayim, or are you doing this at night, right? Some people suggest that actually when you look at the korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, the goal of the korban Pesach in Mitzrayim is to show that you don't worship the gods of the Egyptians. So you have to take specifically a seh, you have to take specifically a lamb, and you also have to do this at Bein HaArbayim because you're expecting that God will take you out, right? Whereas Pesach Dorot, the psukim present it as it's Laila, night, because God did take you out, right? And what you're commemorating in Pesach Dorot is God did take you out. And in terms of the question of what exactly is the animal, it's less of a symbol of taking down Egypt and being against Egyptian gods, and it's more just a korban as a thank you to God for having taken you out, right? So they may have subtly different references. Now, when you looked at the Tosefta in Pesachim, Perek Chet, the Tosefta in Pesachim is much more thoroughgoing than the Mishnah, has a whole list of these are the things that are different between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Dorot, including, by the way, that there were certain mumim, there were certain blemishes that were not considered blemishes in Pesach Mitzrayim, but they were considered blemishes later, right? Including maybe even who you're supposed to take the korban Pesach with, right? It definitely notes what our Gemara and Menachot notes, and that's anachronistic because the Tosefta comes first, but it definitely notes that there's blood and fats on the Mizbeach when it comes to Pesach Dorot. And in Mitzrayim, obviously, you didn't have a Mizbeach, and you certainly didn't have burning of any fats, right? You have in Pesach Mitzrayim, you can't leave your house until the morning. Pesach Dorot, of course, you can, right? It's Pesach Mitzrayim, you shechted in your house. Pesach Dorot, of course, you have to all go to one place, right? There's so many, there's so many differences between them. And the Tosefta Pesachim also then says, but Echad Pesach Mitzrayim, Echad Pesach Dorot, there are ways in which, or Elu Dvarim Sheshaveh Behen Pesach Mitzrayim, the Pesach Dorot, there are ways that they are actually similar, right? So, for example, you had to have a Brit Milah or be a Jew. They shechted it in 3 different shifts, right? Which is not something that you see in the Torah. That's something that is described as what happened in the Beit HaMikdash. It had to be an animal within its first year of its life, a male lamb. You weren't supposed to, leave notar. You weren't supposed to leave it over. And there's even an argument here that Pesach Mitzrayim was 7 days long, and Pesach Dorot is also 7 days long. And Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, no, lo nesar chametz b'Mitzrayim ela yom echad. Actually, in Mitzrayim, you only couldn't have chametz for 1 day, and he learns it from the fact that there's a pasuk that says lo yachel chametz, chametz shouldn't be eaten, and the next pasuk says, hayom, I think it's hayom azeh yatzatim in Mitzrayim, right? And the hayom today, it's connected to lo yachel chametz hayom, right? Chametz shouldn't be eaten today. And most interesting to me is the suggestion in the Tosefta that both Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Dorot require halal, and I'm fascinated by that because are we talking about maybe like Az Yashir? Meaning, obviously, we're not talking about Az Yashir. That's 7 days later, right? We're talking about saying Hallel, saying some sort of Hallel when you're shechting the Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim, when you're eating Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim. It's unclear. So basically, what we have is it's possible that Pesach Mitzrayim has its own conceptual frame, and I think that conceptual frame, the Yerushalmi actually captures it very beautifully. Shalosh mizbechot hayu lavotenu b'Mitzrayim. Our ancestors had 3 altars in Egypt, mashkof u'shtei mezuzot. the post on top, the lintel on top and the two posts on the side. Those were our mizbechot. Those were our altars, right? Which is kind of a beautiful thing. And really, I think we can take this sense of maybe Pesach Mitzrayim, the point there was actually just showing a differentiations from the Egyptians, a belief that God was going to save you. It's pre, it's more of a bakasha kind of korban, like a request kind of korban than it is a hoda, a thank you for something that has happened. Whereas Pesach Dorot is more of a thank you for something that has happened. It's less about showing our differences with the Egyptians from the Egyptians, and it's more actually just showing gratitude to God for taking us out. Now, I want to be very clear, this push and pull of how much is Pesach Mitzrayim like Pesach Dorot, how much is Pesach Dorot like Pesach Mitzrayim, and not. So we started with the pasuk that told us that they could be similar, right? Do the avodah hazot, do this avodah in this chodesh each year, which makes it sound like Pesach Dorot is going to mimic Pesach Mitzrayim. Now, the Gemara in Pesachim on Sadivav Amud Aleph that is commenting on the mishnah that we looked at before that said the difference between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Dorot is taking it on the 10th, etc., etc. The Gemara indicates why would you think that taking it on the 10th, for example, is not the same for Pesach Dorot. So the Gemara says, Min nalon, from where Dechtiv is, it is written, Dabru el koladat Yisrael lemor, speak to all of the congregation of Israel, saying, Ba'asor lachodesh hazeh v'ikhu, etc. On the 10th of this month, and they will take. So over and over again, you'll see if you look at the Gemara there, the word zeh, the word zot, the word indicates that it's referring only to the time in Mitzrayim. So it's on the 10th of this Nisan, not other Nisans in the future. So Zet Mikchob Mi Ba'asor, this one is supposed to be taken from the 10th of Nisan. Ve'ein Pesach Dorot Mikchob Ba'asor, and future Pesachs should not be. And then the Gemara says, but wait, and I'm skipping a little bit, meaning I gave you an ellipsis because I want to get to where the Gemara comes back to this issue. Gemara says, well, actually, Pesach Dorot Nami, you actually do have to take the Pesach Dorot 4 days before, because Haktiv, does it not say, Va'avadata et avodah hazot, you're supposed to do this particular avodah, and here hazot does not mean only Pesach Mitzrayim, it means take Pesach Mitzrayim, bring it to the future. B'chodesh hazeh, in this time, shiur kol avodot chodesh zeh, kazeh, right? Anytime you do the avodah in this month, it should be like this, right? So in other words, actually, the hazeh in the pasuk that says that you should take Be'asor lachodesh hazeh does not actually narrow it to being a reference to Pesach Mitzrayim only, because for Pesach Dorot, they also took it 4 days ahead of time. And for those who remember from our learning, I think in Tzvalchim, for Korban Talmud, they also took it 4 days ahead of time, right? So Elahahu Hazeh, so what does the Hazeh come to teach you in the pasuk that says you should take it on the 10th of the Chodesh Hazeh? Lemiyute Pesach Sheni Tekavate. Meaning, if you have to do a Pesach Sheni, you don't take it 4 days in advance, okay? Now the Gemara continues. It says, okay, let's try this again. Elameata ve'achlu tabasar b'layla hazeh, right? We also have a pasuk in Shemot chapter 12 that says you will eat the meat on this night. Hachinami dezen echal b'layla ve'en acher echal b'layla. Maybe that should actually be saying that the only korban Pesach that's eaten at night, because it says Balayla Hazeh, is the one in Mitzrayim. Maybe Pesach Dorot shouldn't be eaten at night. So Amar Kra, no, but we have that pasuk that says Va'avad ta'avodah. It's missing the key word Hazot, right? No, you're going to do this same avodah in the future, right? So you see the push and pull. Right? So what's the hazeh for? The hazeh is for the machloket between Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva to try to figure out until what time can you eat korban Pesach, and until what time can you eat afikomen. And then it goes on again. It keeps going back and forth between the fact that there are so many things in Shemot Yud Bet that say you do this in this time, you do this in this time, you do this in this time. And that makes it sound like it's only Pesach Mitzrayim. And then over and over again, the Gemara brings back the pasuk in Parakid Gimel of Shmot that we started with, that no, 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 you're going to do this avoda in the future as well, right? So something similar, some things different. Now, I want to point something out. There really are two different, two major differences. I mean, I guess the difference between, are you going to give the korban bein harbaim, or are you going to give the korban at night? Okay, that could be a major difference between Shmot Yud Bet and Devarim Tet Zayin, right? Between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Dorot. But there's also, obviously, the biggest thing is, are you doing this in your house? Or are you doing this in the Beit HaMikdash, right? Are you doing this in your house? You're doing this at the Mishkan, right? And there's so many reasons why you would find a distinction. We said one already, the point of showing that you're different from the Egyptians, making your house into the altar, making your home into a place, choosing to show that you're going to follow Hashem, as opposed to the Mishkan when it's already been developed, it's already been right, and everybody has to go there. But it's interesting, there's another difference that our Mishnah in Menachot took for granted, which is, it says Tzonu Bakar in Devarim Tet Zayin about the Korban Pesach. And actually, when you look at Shmot Yud Bet, you're only allowed to eat, you're only allowed to have it from a seh or from izim, right? Meaning you're only allowed to have it from, sheepfolk. Sheepfolk, I don't know what that means, but sheepfolk, right? So the Mechilta, it's interesting, the Mechilta is the halachic midrash on Shmot. There's two Mechiltas. One is Mechilta de Rabbi Shmuel, which comes from the school of Rabbi Shmuel. One is Mechilta de Rabbi Shmuel Yochai, which comes from the school of Rabbi Akiva. And they're both noticing this, why does it say Tzon Ubakar in Dvarim Tet Zayin? So Rabbi Eliezer Omer Tzon LePesach Ubakar LeChagiga. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, it's you give from the sheepfold for the korban Pesach, and the bakar goes for the korban chagiga, right? A different korban that you bring when you do aliyah l'regel. Ata omer kein, really? Oh, echad zeh ve'echad zeh b'Pesach. Maybe they're both allowed on Pesach, a tzon or a bakar. Umani mekayem set tamim zachar ben shana aliyah lachem. So then, how would I fulfill what it said in Shemot Yud Bet, that it has to be a male lamb within its first year? Well, Pesach Mitzrayim, maybe that only refers to Pesach Mitzrayim. Maybe you only give a lamb in Pesach Mitzrayim. About Pesach Dorot, maybe in the Pesach of any year, Yaviz Mizeh Mizeh. You could bring from either one. You could bring from cattle too. Tilmod Lomar, which by the way I love because I always say Talmud Lomar, and the way it's the Nikudot here says Tilmod Lomar. It's always good to unseat yourself from certain things. Talmud lomar ushmartem et hadavar hazeh lechok lecha. Well, actually, we have a pasuk, and I just want to point out that's not the pasuk that we started with in Shmot Yud Gimel. It's a pasuk that's already in Shmot Yud Bet that says you're going to keep this thing in the future, and this thing is you got to make sure that it's of sheep and not of cattle. Hare Pesach Dorot Amor, it's indicating that it's going to be in the future in Pesach Dorot. Im Kain, if that's the case, Ma Talmud Lomar or Ma Talmud Lomar, why does it say, why does Dvarim Tet Zayin say you should slaughter for God sheep or cattle? Tzon LePesach u'Bakar LeChagiga. Fine, so we're going to apply Tzon is going to be for the Korban Pesach, Bakar is going to be the Korban Chagiga. Now, of course, this is a great shot versus drash conversation to have in terms of Chazal. How much are they, bound by the context, and how much are they not bound by the context? But for another day. Now, by the way, in the Mechilta the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, right? You have our pasuk of the Avadata et Avodah Hazot b'Chodesh Hazeh used, right, to make the same point, right? Michlal shene'emar v'zebachta Pesach l'Hashem Elokecha tzon u'bakar. The fact that it says in Devarim Tet Zayin that you could use either tzon or bakar for a korban Pesach, yachol yeh Pesach Dorot ba min hatzon u'min bakar. Maybe you would think that while Pesach Mitzrayim had to be from a set tamim zachar ben shana, Pesach Dorot could be given from even cattle. Talmud Lomar or Talmud Lomar. Right? Comes back our pasuk of nope, you're going to do this exact korban, you're going to do this exact avodah in the future. Right? Ma Pesach Mitzrayim lo ba ela min hakvasim min hazim. Just as the Pesach of Egypt could only come from lamb or from goats. Af Pesach Dorot eino ba ela min hakvasim o min hazim. Right? It also Pesach Dorot can only come from lamb or goats. Now I want to end with a really nice thing that Rabbi Mordechai Breuer had to say about the difference. We mentioned, right, possible difference between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Dorot ideationally, and he wants to talk about a little bit the difference between eating a korban Pesach at home and doing the shechita at home versus doing the shechita and the korban and the matan damim, putting the blood on the mizbeach, and the haktarat chalavim, and putting the fats on the mizbeach. He wants to make a distinction and tell us something about why Pesach Mitzrayim wouldn't require the latter, right? Whereas Pesach Dorot does. He says, "Ulam." I'll skip this. Yesh avdel akroni ben Pesach Mitzrayim or ben Pesach Dorot. There is a principal difference between the Pesach of Egypt and the Pesach of future generations. But Pesach Mitzrayim o Yisrael kravim el Hashem. In the Pesach in Egypt, the Jewish people were close to God. They felt like they were at God's table on their own. Because God was about to go through the land of Egypt and strike the firstborn. And at that time, God skipped over, or as I prefer to read it in the Torah, God protected the houses of the Jewish people, mishum shehein amo v'nachlato, because they're God's nation and God's inheritance. Ulefichach ka'asher hayu mesubin al shulchan haPesach. Therefore, when they were sitting around the Pesach table, meaning the Paschal Lamb table, mitzapim l'ma'avar hashchina, waiting for God to pass over, ka'asher ra'u et atzmam, kvar ra'u et atzmam yoshvim al shulchan hamelech, they already saw themselves sitting at the sovereign's table, ve'ochlim misudato, and eating from God's meal. Mishum kach lo haya kol tzorach she'ochlu basar korban. It didn't have to be, the korban Pesach didn't have to be a real korban. It didn't have to have all the halachot of a korban. It didn't have to be given on the mizbeach. They already could feel that they were eating from shulchan gavoha, meaning the ki'ilu, the as if, the table of God. Even though the Pesach itself didn't really have a lot of the characteristics of a korban. Shoneh davar bePesach Dorot, it's different in the Pesach of the future generations. Oto Pesach kariv be'eretz Yisrael b'miskeret olam hanoheg kiminhago. Those Pesachs are in a time when the world just goes by its regular patterns, meaning you're not seeing open miracles and things of that sort. Mishum kach ein ochlin nachshavin ochlim mishalgan gavoa. Therefore, people are not going to think of themselves, or they're not going to be thought of, I should say, considered eating from God's table, so to speak. Unless, that is, they actually go to the mikdash, and the sum of what they're going to eat, some of the bigger portion of what this was before they eat what they eat, the blood of it has gone onto the altar, onto the side of the altar, and the owners of it have gotten kapara, have gotten atonement based on the worship that's done using the blood, al pi haseder haragil shel korbanot, like a regular korban. So the distinction that she's trying to make is the Jewish people felt incredibly close to God at the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim, whereas Pesach Dorot, you're not living with open miracles, and you actually have to go somewhere and do something that's actually going to engage you in the idea that you are eating, quote unquote, from God's table. Now, what I think is really beautiful about all of this is the possibility that the very same ritual that was done in Mitzrayim and that we do today might reflect differently on where we are as a people. And I would just end, because we really are a few days before Pesach, is that wherever you are listening to this shiur and learning this shiur, I hope that, of course, the matzah, that's the stand-in for the Pesach, and of course, the Haggadah, that's the stand-in for the Pesach, and of course, all of the things that we do to prepare for Pesach, all the things that we do, that they should actually give you a sense of eating mishulchan gavoa, meaning of actually eating with a spiritual sense of being in God's presence. Wishing everybody a chag kasher v'sameach.